One of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the past 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So when we do something pleasurable, we tip one way, painful, it tips the other. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to be level, which scientists call homeostasis. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance after any deviation from neutrality. So let's say, after an orgasm, and an orgasm releases a whole lot of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, we get this tip to pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brains adapt to increased dopamine by downregulating our own dopamine receptors and our own dopamine production, not just to baseline level, but below baseline level. That's the come down, right, or the after effect. I imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance, so they stay on until we're tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That is that moment that we experience right after the intense pleasure. And initially in our forays with pleasure in all its various forms, we might not even notice that come down. It might be outside of our conscious awareness, but it's there. And it's the price that we pay for every pleasure. It's the way the brain restores homeostasis. Whatever the initial stimulus is, it first tips an equal and opposite amount to the other side before going back to level. That's also true for painful stimuli. When we exercise, we press on the pain side of the balance. Those gremlins hop on the pleasure side and we feel good. That's a runner's high, right? And then they hop off and we restore homeostasis. So that's the fundamental rule. Now let's get into what happens with the addicted brain. With repeated exposure to the same or similar reinforcing stimulus, that initial response gets weaker and shorter. That is, the dopamine release gets less, but that after response gets stronger and longer. In other words, those little gremlins start to accumulate and they start to get muscles, right? And pretty soon we end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And then we're in what is called a dopamine deficit state. And the gremlins, if we do it enough, they camp out there. They're sort of living on the balance. That means when we're not using, right, we're walking around in a dopamine deficit state. We're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance: anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, craving. Other things are less enjoyable, right? Other things that used to give us pleasure no longer do. And now we need to keep using, not to even get high, but just to feel normal and restore the balance. And it is this dopamine deficit state, that overwhelming physiology to want to restore homeostasis, which drives the addicted brain and drives repeated use, and explains also why we need more of our drug and more potent forms, for example, more deviant forms of pornography over time to get the same effect, or more deviant fantasies. We started out with a kind of like a generic fantasy, and now we've got this kind of crazy stuff going on, right, in our heads. And it's all those gremlins we're at war with the gremlins, just trying to get more and more to create, homeostasis.